morning, and thank you for inviting me. I'm standing here because this is a courtyard theatre, and I know that you won't be really happy if I just go straight there and you just look at the top of my head. And yes, and since I am actually short, anyway, it's like you just don't know what I look. I just look like a mushroom. I just want to make that point before I sort of embark on some of the things I'm going to think about with you, because the story you tell about what's important and who matters features in every aspect of how you lay out a room, how you design a framework, because in the end, I think to be amongst festival makers like yourself, my hunch is it's because we believe that all stories matter and that little stories matter as much as big stories. In fact, little stories often are the bigger stories that people are holding back from knowing or holding back from understanding. And so all the time, in every aspect of working as an artist, we need to be on the lookout for when is an assumption about importance the case, and what is that doing to undermine somebody else's sense of importance? And I don't say that to criticize, by the way, where the podium was set, so please don't think that. But I'm just trying to make the point that all the time, we, as artists, as practitioners, as makers, have got to think about the entire context of a moment in time and the space in which it happens, and the conversations and with whom, in order to be clear about what we think matters. We don't have titles in our passports anymore, except our name. It doesn't say what we are, at least they're not in the European passport that I'm about to relinquish. But if I had a word in my passport to say what I was, I would cling on to the idea that it would say Jude Kelly artist, even though it's a contested word. And some of you may not identify with that word personally at all. But I would hold on to the word artist whilst noting that actually, to a certain extent, you have to be self-determining about that word. Artist, like so many words, gets co-opted and has status collected around it. Sometimes very positive status, sometimes ridiculously high levels of status, inappropriate high levels of status at times. But it's also a word of denigration. In some places, in some parts of the world, it's a word of fear. And of course, I don't know whether you use the phrase lovies, but if you really want to put an artist down, you can just call them a lovey and suggest that all this touchy-feely stuff really doesn't count. And the same is true for a word like audience, because if you think about the hierarchy of a word, the word audience implies always that you are basically passively watching a thing that has been predetermined for you, and your job is to appreciate, discern, maybe criticize, whatever. And then the lower level of that word would be punter. I think that in determining that I became very, very committed, like you all are, to being a festival maker, it came out of my continual investigation, and I would even say struggle, to think about the meaning of equality in relationship to creativity. I was a little girl who discovered dancing because she had flat feet, and went to the doctors and was told that ballet would be good for me. And like so many people, your accidental moment when you find art can be the most transformative thing. But there was no question of me sort of being sent to go and do the arts in Liverpool when I was growing up. It was just a happen chance. But what an amazing happen chance. But it's left me with the knowledge that as I travelled up my career path, well, I wouldn't have ever called it a career path because I didn't see the path and I didn't know it was going to be called a career. But as I carried on doing the things I love and having success doing them, which is a blessing, the gap between me and my family in Liverpool got ever wider because I was doing the arts. And my grandmother, who left school when she was 12 and had 14 children, my dad being the youngest, some of those cousins and so on, actually just find the whole notion of what I do intimidating because of this word art and this word culture, etc. But I have found that when I've said to them, I'm doing a festival, there's no moment when they kind of look quizzical and think, what do you think that means? But actually, the word festival is a sort of passport to the idea that you can belong inside space and time that you will have some agency in, which is a very different kind of word than culture or art. Culture and art are so conflicting in the impression they make when they hit somebody's brain about, do they belong inside that word or not? Whereas festivals, somehow everybody's been to one, seen one, heard about one, thought about making one, and it includes celebration. You very rarely imagine the word festival and think, oh, that's going to make me feel stupid. That's going to make me feel alienated. You tend with the word festival to think, well, somewhere in some nook or cranny, at least I'll be able to get a drink. Now, I just want to tell you a little bit about my first moment when I came to Limerick. I was 19. I got a scholarship to study rural community drama, in particular in the Gaeltacht regions. Now, why was I doing that? Because I was somebody called Kelly, and I was studying drama at university, and I was studying Yeats and Synge and Lady Gregory, etc. And I started to think, but this co-option, not a criticism, but a fact, of so much of the life and meaning of communities is being corralled into very, very beautiful, meaningful work, which has very little chance of being re-disseminated back again in a way where the value of it would be recognized and respected. And so I sort of had it in my mind because I'd begun to think about this quandary of how do you make the right to art, which every single human being has, and you can see it in cave paintings. I mean, every identity and ritual that humans have ever set about to do, ever, has contained music, has contained visual arts, has contained dance, always. So this is not something that we kind of arrived at through education. It is inside us as humans. So that dilemma of here we are with that human right, and then here we are in a world that then organizes it so some people have it more than others, and some people are made to feel it is of less value to them, less appropriate to them, and less importance to them. How do you square that? What is the value of putting those two things together and put them back together? This was the thing I've been wrestling with, I suppose, all my life. And so I was interested in whether Ireland, with its belief in rural community work, had sort of got the answer. You didn't, by the way. But so I arrived at 19 in Limerick on this little scholarship that I had. I was all by myself. I had never been to Ireland before. I kind of didn't have the faintest idea what I was doing. You know that feeling. It never leaves you. And as it so happened, the Fleadh was on. And there was nowhere to stay at all. Of course, I hadn't arranged anything. And so I knocked on a few doors, and eventually this woman took pity on me, and she said, well, we sort of have got a bed you can stay in. Just stay there a minute in the hall. And I heard all this banging and crashing, etc., etc., etc. And then about 10 minutes later, she came out and said, oh, I can show you to your room now. So I went into this little tiny room and put my stuff down and opened a cupboard. About 40 shoes fell out. I closed it back up again, and I thought, okay, well, this is probably a child's room. Maybe that's very kind of them. And I went out onto the streets and experienced the Fleadh. And that was the first time I think I had seen this thing which you are so familiar with, which is the interchangeable nature of virtuosic playing and then being part of the same crowd who's watching somebody else and appreciating. This complete symbiosis of participant, audience, player, and fellow celebrator. It was absolutely amazing. Almost as amazing as coming back that night with my knapsack, having the same ritual of being made to stay in the hall while banging and crashing happened, going into my bedroom, getting into bed and realizing it was warm. And that what I was actually probably doing was turfing out some night worker who'd been sleeping the day in the bed and taking his or her place. Well, I was grateful. I didn't care. While I was there, I was told about this maker of art, an artist priest in Tralee, in Kerry. And to cut a long story short, because I'm not going to make this the subject of my talk, I went down and met Father Paterhan, who created at that time the Tok Shemses and Shemsa Tira then. And it was a revelation and an absolute influence on my practice, that this idea of celebrating the stories that matter to a community through art, through artistic practice, so that those stories could be reflected back to communities in their own terms, in a way that both elevated it, but was not unrecognizable. It wasn't reappropriated, it was returned back through artistic practice. And I suppose in a way that is what I have wanted to spend most of my life doing, finding the right way to find stories that mattered, and then to return them back in a way that the person who would have told you it, had they ever been given the platform, would both recognize, but also not recognize in certain ways, because there's a mystery to art, there's a transformation quality in art, there's something that happens with artistic practice that makes something that was entirely personal go out and belong to the many. And that is an astonishing thing too. So I started making festivals in the 80s, well, more or less as soon as I sort of left university. Really, I'm a theatre maker. Obviously, that's why I tell stories and why I create plays and opera productions. But seriously, my frustration lies, speaking about architecture, so many times when, despite the importance of a story that I wanted to tell in theatre form, I couldn't manage the context in which the story got told. I couldn't manage the experience of the welcome when the audience came in, or not welcome when they came in to buy a ticket. I couldn't manage the cost in relationship to the experience. I couldn't manage the word theatre out of people's minds that would make them not come in the first place. There were so many things I couldn't create to make that story have a context of welcome and rights. And although that wouldn't stop me and doesn't stop me making theatre or dance or concerts or whatever, the deeper question for me around this area of human rights is, what form is it that makes all of us think, well, we belong, and we'll choose ourselves the way that we manage this context that's being offered. And for me, this is the word festival, the meaning of festival. Because automatically, in the idea of festival, you hand back to the participants the notion that it couldn't possibly happen without them, and that one of them wouldn't be enough. With theatre, you always say, well, as long as there's more people in the audience than on the stage, we'll just go ahead. Laudable, but miserable, I can tell you. But that's not what will need to happen in a festival. In a festival, it will be a gathering. It will be a gathering that matters, and the people that matter most, or equally, let me say equally, will be the audience, who will indeed, many of them, be participating at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, but watching something at 10. And that sort of ecumenical idea of people coming together starts with this notion of identity. Festivals, again, like cave paintings, must have begun more or less as soon as there were enough of us to do something more than on our own. And the reinforcement of identity through festival making. Is that me? stand stiller. The reinforcement of festival making through dance practice, through ritual, very often, of course, was saying, this is who we are. And sometimes it's going to throw a protective boundary around yourselves. And that identity practice, whether it be LGBTQ+, whether it be disabled festival, unlimited as an example, that throwing a magic cordon around yourselves and saying, we will present ourselves in the way that we see fit. We'll take away prejudicial words and we'll replace them with different words. We will celebrate identity. We will make you see us in a new light. And even if you're not here, we will reinforce who we are. This is a profound and wonderful thing. Of course, it can be very tribal, and tribal can also be excluding. And so, a question around festivals is, despite this amazing ability to throw open doors, throw open space, do they ever also inevitably make you feel excluded? I mean, I'm unlikely to go to a religious festival that I don't have any connection with, but I'm privileged to watch it maybe on the television. Don't worry, I think they can hear me anyway. It's a theatre. So, whilst absolutely believing that celebrating identity in a way that reinforces your sense of self, particularly if your sense of self has been traduced, has been demeaned, or it's just been kind of obliterated or ignored, this is an incredibly important thing. And I would say, I'll give you an example. Rochdale, maybe you've heard of it. It's a town in the north. Its most famous export story at the moment is hundreds and hundreds of girls being exploited as sex objects between the ages of 13 and 15. And that famous story is what people think about when they think of Rochdale. And so Rochdale have approached me and the WOW Festival to say, we would like a completely different story about girls and women. We have to obliterate that story and change it. And that seems a marvelous challenge for a festival to take on. What is it that we can celebrate in Rochdale and without minimizing the scars and the casualties of a story that does exist? But of course, that story of change-making, to take your title here, can also be just, do we understand how wonderful this village is? Do we who live here understand how wonderful it is? Do we even know our own community? Shall we do something about that then? There's no bad reason for having a festival. No, none. Unless it's to say to the next village, you're useless. That would be a bad idea. We talk about the transformational properties of art. It transforms in two ways. Of course, once you're in the inner sanctum, you can have those experiences where a story or a piece of music or a piece of visual art or kinetic moment, it changes your sense of self, sometimes just temporarily, sometimes forever. That is the amazing thing about what humans do as art makers. But I think festivals can do that in a different way, partly because there's a sort of unspoken agreement when you head for a festival, which is that time will be much more fluid. You don't tend to go to a festival and go, I need to get there at 7:30, we'll be on the 9:30 train out, unless you are a festival maker going to somebody else's festival. Most people use it as an opportunity to let go of time and move about in space and say, well, I've booked for these three things, but I'm secretly hoping to bump into some stuff that I just don't know anything about. And I'm kind of hoping that this will be sold out, because then I'll be forced to go to the puppet show. And that'll be the thing when actually I see something that I didn't bargain on. And giving people license to choose, to play around, to not go to shows they had bought tickets for and stay in the pub instead and fall in love. These are all things that festivals do brilliantly. I talked earlier about architecture. we don't have much control over how our towns and cities, or even our urban environments, are designed. You know, they're designed, I mean, form and function are supposed to be beautiful. They rarely are. But when you have a festival, you have some control over architectural intervention. 5 things that you just thought were one kind of building can be transformed into another kind of building. You can put up famously bunting. Somebody said to me the other day, I hear you don't like bunting. I said, you could not be more wrong. Bunting is a great source of joy. You can, it's true. Balloons, decorations, frivolity, ephemeral. Festivals are ephemeral, like we all are. You know, they'll be gone. But then not ephemeral, because they are memories. When you walk down that street, it's back to what it was before, but you can remember when it had its buntings and its balloons and its art interventions and its musicians spilling onto the streets. And that is the joy. You know, you have to have these intervention moments when you can completely change the reality of the day-to-day and turn it into something else and celebrate. Some festivals, I'm going to at some point talk about the festivals I've created, but I didn't really want this talk to be an advert for my work. It's really a kind of some of the thoughts I've had as I've been making festivals. The early festivals I made really were about art forms, and still are to some extent, recognizing that, you know, contemporary dance isn't something, when you're running Battersea Arts Centre, when I started Battersea Arts Centre, you know, most people wouldn't go to a contemporary dance show. But I don't know any mum and dad who weren't happy if their kids came back and said, I want to go and do some dancing. You know, there is always a relationship between art making and children. And nearly every single parent will want their child to do their homework, of course, you know, get their maths under their belt. I mean, there's all those sort of ideas as well about the importance of creativity. But if they come back and they say, I want to play a musical instrument, most parents are thrilled, which is not the same as it translating in their heads to, please go and see this classical concert at 7:30, you'll enjoy it. So I began to try to work out, well, what is the relationship between community yearning for different opportunities, different ways of seeing yourself, seeing your children, seeing your grandchildren, windows open into new possibilities. And what happens if you've studied under Merce Cunningham and have a very, very extremely erudite but kind of almost unknowable arts practice for most people? And for me, the answer was put them together in a festival. I don't just mean bung the lot into one hot thing and hope it just works. Not at all. Bunging things together is not artistic practice. I'll just say that. Just because you have loads of stuff doesn't mean it's a festival. But curating, what is the relationship, what is this circular relationship between the person who is doing Merce Cunningham third generation work and the mum and dad who kind of goes, my girl or boy has just come back and they want to be a tap dancer. You know, there is a relationship. So I started to think about how words like dance can be reinvestigated in several contexts, and then creating contexts where the value of your children's desire to do some jumping about, like I did when I was 5, has to matter as much as the value of somebody who has then studied it for 20 years and is virtuosic. I don't mean that little person jumping up and down should be, I don't mean you pay £20.50 to go and see them. But what I mean is you have to help us to understand and respect this umbilical cord and not sever it, which the word art and culture has so often done, because it's severed into saying we are very rich, we are a court culture, we are a power, we are colonial, we are imperial, whatever it is you want, and we collect the greatest of art. And you can have the rest of it, which is a sort of community folk bit. And for a long time, the arts councils of the world, when they exist, had that idea as well, which is that what I would call court culture is the thing to study and be valued. And community culture is a nice thing to have for people, but they can do it on their own. And that severs this connection. And I think festivals put it back together again and inquire into it in a really important and profound way. I'm going to show you a few pieces of work that I've done, but really it's, again, some of the things I'm thinking about all the time. And then we'll have some questions. So I'm now walking over here, folks. Right, change of dynamic. Right. So this is a festival I did with Baba Mal, the Senegal artist, called Africa Utopia. As you can see, I am not African. Once upon a time, maybe, probably, well, definitely. But that's such a long time ago. I'm a white, cisgendered, older woman from the UK, well, from Liverpool, actually. So, like, what gives me the right to do Africa Utopia? Well, in my experience, only with the blessing of Baba Mal. Somebody, I think, when you're looking at work that is, like, not yours, you have to basically offer yourself as an ally to other people. So this was part of my work at Southbank Centre, and obviously Southbank Centre is for those of you who don't know it, it's one of the largest centres for the arts in the world. It's like, I think it's the largest in Europe in terms of a singly run space. So here was I, this Liverpudlian 5-year-old, now running one of these huge art spaces as artistic director. And that means that you are a gatekeeper or a gate opener, and you have access to space, which is also time, which is also resource, and it's the most amazing privilege, and you've got to give it away. But you can't just like give it away unknowingly. You are still a curator, you still have your artistic practice. But one of the things that we'll all be very aware of is how the word Africa, which is a continent, usually gets taken down to almost mean a country, and then, you know, it's a country where, like, white saviors have had a very strong relationship for very long, and very difficult for the continent of Africa to declare its own values in its own way. And the phrase Africa Utopia was really what came from the idea of what is it that Africa can teach the world. Anyway, I won't go into this festival in great detail, but the centerpiece visually to this, which isn't on this, was a huge baobab tree, you know, the kind of tree that people sit under often to be educated, schools gather under. And we asked young people from the area, from Lambeth, to bring pieces of their grandparents' traditional cloth. And this tree was made up of all of these hundreds of pieces of cloth. That, of course, meant all the grandparents came to see this tree. We did a blessing around the tree. I'm speaking of things that you will have done, I'm sure, in your own communities. I don't mean that particular idea, but, you know, something where you take an idea of community practice and then you make sure that it is so huge, but also forensically detailed in its artistic practice, that people can see that it had meaning. It had multiple levels of meaning. So, of course, all of those families who came to see this tree, which their children and grandchildren had created, became part of the festival audience. But also they offered up other things to do. And the fashion show, because I really think in festivals you also blur the lines between, like, what's proper art and what's, like, not art. And, you know, the great designers and makers across the African continent, one of the things that they are doing so brilliantly is young fashion. And since most people across the continent of Africa are under 35, then youth voices in a festival like this becomes a key thing. Things that we don't like to talk about. Well, look, here we are. We're all going to die. So we share that, don't we? I mean, we might not all share a love of classical music, but we all share the fact that we're going to die. And yet, it's something that people find difficult to talk about. But not in every culture. I mean, if you go to Ghana, and probably some of you have, there's these Ghanaian coffins. You can choose your own. You can decide to be buried in a ballet point shoe. That's a possibility for me. Or you can go into a Lamborghini, or you can get into an electric guitar. I mean, there's all kinds of ways you can go down. But I wanted to do a festival of death because we all share that, and because we don't like talking about it, particularly in England. I'm going to say that as opposed to the UK, because obviously the Scots, the Irish, and the Welsh are a bit healthier. But England finds it really hard to talk about death. And I wanted us to cover all kinds of things, from, you know, digital wills to the idea of children on wards where they have, you know, where they're going to die, struggling with the problem of trying to help their parents come to terms with their own deaths, the conversations we had. So this massive umbrella called the Festival of Death attracted thousands of people. I truly believe that if I'd done like an evening to talk about digital wills, or an afternoon to talk about pastoral care of children to parents, who would have turned up? A few. You do a Festival of Death, thousands of people came, thousands, to meet in the death cafes, to look around the coffins, and to do things like this. Before I die, I want to. You know, and this was a particularly moving moment. If you remember, Amy filled in this. I'm talking to my partner. People you knew who died, little space where you can say things I remember about you. Rituals are part of festivals, and these tiny interventions live with you forever. You can't, with festivals, I don't think, make it something which is just about presenting, you know, the individual paid performance, however many there are. It's got to be about the excitement of space and participation. But this was a festival I like mainly to now work in a place where I'll be very frightened. I think it's true of most artists that if you're not frightened, then you're frightened, you're not frightened. If you go into a rehearsal room and you know that you start directing in a way that you've sort of done before, you know what you're going to do, you know you're dying, speaking of death. It's very, very creatively agonizing to not be frightened. And although, as you heard earlier, I've done 10 years of a festival called Wow, Women of the World, which I'll talk about in a minute, I realized that, you know, the elephant in the room were men, not obviously elephants. Because, you know, gender isn't women. Gender is all of us. And I realized that if women are in a prison in some respects in terms of identity, then so are men, obviously. So I decided a festival called BAM, Being a Man. I'm not a man. But nobody else was doing it. And there was an urgency. And I thought, well, I can be an ally. I've got the time, I've got the space, I've got the belief, and I have the love. I love men in my life. You know, there's one. Happy Valentine's, Andrew. My son, my dad, you know, etc. So you can find ways of speaking about stories that aren't yours, provided the context is created and that you care. You really, really care. So this festival, Being a Man, was full of amazing stuff. I mean, there's Stephen Green, the DJ, talking about his father's suicide and therefore his own near suicide and everything that comes from not being able to cry as a working class man. And there were so many talks and debates and shows, etc. And it, again, permission. It gave men and boys and women who came permission, because it was a festival, to speak of things, to use words, to explore stuff that they wouldn't have done otherwise. I'm going to move swiftly on. Unlimited, Festival of Disability, amazing, including this one down here with Liz Carr from Silent Witness, who's just now going to be in an amazing piece of Hollywood drama. But that was her suicide piece about voluntary suicide, the musical it was called. Let me show you a tiny trailer for something that I wrestled with most, which was how to make classical music of the 20th century matter to ordinary people, even people who went to classical music but stopped at 1920. Anybody here does classical music? 1, 2, 3-ish, 4, 5, 6, okay. classical music is probably at the top of the hierarchy of art form meaning, although visual arts makes more money. So this is how I try to attract people to understand that the music, like all art, doesn't come without a context. We make it in the real world we're in. It's not something separate. And I wanted people to think about history. Why were artists refusing certainty and insisting on music that was uncertain? Why were artists saying, I'm throwing away melody because form of melody can never exist again against this backdrop? These are the interesting things. Why do we make art in the context we make it? This was a year-long festival. We had weekends covering each part of the century. We had thousands of people who'd never been to classical music ever, but they were interested in their history. That's why we make art, in response to being a human. And if you remove that from people, and it floats all by itself, it doesn't somehow make sense. And if you put punk music up against Stockhausen, you suddenly realise that we actually do belong together, historically and artistically. Anyway, obviously it was a trigger, but it kind of worked, because I was really trying to say, this is not just about art, it's about us as people. And when you look at festivals like Fez, I don't know who has been here to the Fez Music Festival. It's a very, very long festival. Fez is one of the oldest university towns in the world. I think it was only the second university to be established in the world, before Oxford and Cambridge. They had this marvellous music festival built from one man's idea of creating peace between Muslims and Christians and around an olive tree. But the festival grew to such proportions that the local people hated it because they felt they had nothing to do with it. Here was all these people coming in to discuss peace. And actually, Fez people felt there was nothing to do with them. And so Fauzi suddenly realised that what he needed to think about was the very root and meaning of why he'd done the festival to begin with, which was hospitality and peace and harmony. And then he suddenly realised that, of course, you know, Arab people have an incredible history of hospitality. So he went out and asked Fez people, would they provide bed and breakfasts? Sounds like a simple gesture. It became an enormous part of the festival, the meaning of the festival, by sort of taking the very root and meaning and then saying, but what does this mean to the community in which I live? And then Burning Man. I don't know whoever's been to Burning Man. Anybody been to Burning Man? One person? Two people? Right, it's not what you think. It isn't everybody getting naked and having sex, just so as you know. I think that is on offer. But it grew from a festival on a beach, which was to do with burning the man, i.e. non-institutional, get away from bureaucracy, challenge the state. There are now 65,000 people who arrive for 5 days in the middle of the Nevada desert, and their main mantra is leave no trace. So at the end of this festival, where you can't buy anything, you have to gift everything to each other, and it's a sort of model of what could a world look like. Can't really ever look like that forever, but we could practice and pretend it looked like that for a while. It might teach us something. At the end, everybody walks hand in hand, thousands of people walking hand in hand, walking like this, studying the desert, picking up every tiny, tiny fragment of what's left over, a sequin, a cigarette butt, until there is no trace left. So it isn't just like it's ephemeral, but it is respecting the landscape in a profound way. I'm just going to end with WOW, because obviously that is what I'm doing, not only what I'm doing at the moment, I'm also working with the Robert F. Kennedy Foundation for Human Rights, doing a festival of human rights at the moment, another phrase that is so jargon-led and difficult for many people. But, you know, of course I'm interested in how do you make women's voices centrally creative. I think there is an absolute relationship between human rights and art in this respect. Is the work, when we say refugee artists, do we mean they're an artist who happens to be a refugee, just because that's the circumstance, or do we mean they're a refugee artist? Refugee artists, you don't really need their work to be that great, but you definitely need them to be a refugee, because otherwise you can't raise the money or you can't raise the pity. But an artist who happens to be a refugee does not want to be a refugee artist. And as a woman, I didn't really want to be a woman artist, I just wanted to be an artist. But I was continually told that I was a woman, and therefore my art needed to be seen in that context. And eventually you get to the stage where you say, okay, well that's because the landscape doesn't equal equality, therefore we will need to recognise the fact that until women's stories told by artists and others are given equal weight to men's, that means that women's rights can't be given equal weights to men. It is much more difficult to raise the issue of domestic violence as being of the same potency as male knife crime. It's very difficult. But that's another whole lecture. But what I will do is just finish on this little film, if I may, so that you can see that in the end, I think the thing I believe in most, really, is celebration. Wow, women of the world. Wow is a festival because celebration creates optimism. Optimism creates determination and energy, and that makes you feel that anything's possible.
Meeting all these fabulous women, all amazing at what they do, top of their games.
It's a great event to celebrate women. It's so diverse and there's so much going on.
The great thing about the WOW Festival is you people from all walks of life come in here and there's a really great vibe.
Very welcoming to men as well.
It's for anybody who is thinking about the amazing world we would have if gender equality could come about.
Raise that awareness and help people understand that women do make a larger contribution than we know of.
Now today is our first big day of our Women of the World Festival.
All around the WOW Festival, you'll hear music, you'll hear stand-up poetry, but you can also take part in lots of things. Sport, you can try abseiling. We have the British women weightlifters giving a display. You can roam around the marketplace and look for things to buy and organisations that you might want to join.
We're here to represent our organisation. We essentially give a platform for young women to discuss gender issues in Scotland.
We have speed mentoring. We have lots of panels that are interactive with the audience, talking about particular themes.
All this talk about women is because they have been oppressed because they're women. What if we tried reversing that just to kind of make somebody unwilling to see?
We just got back from the food and feminism talk, which I thought was really interesting, that kind of like link between domesticity and women.
This morning I've just chaired an event including some of Sister Sledge.
My sister and I are so honoured that we were asked to be a part of this amazing Women of the World.
Think-ins with other women and boys and men together.
I was doing an In Conversation with Baroness Doreen Lawrence and Jude Kelly.
This is the real secret of WOW. We do laugh a lot.
Women, never put your tights in a washing machine. It will shatter the lycra. Simply, when you're washing your hair in the shower, just wash them there with shampoo and leave them over the radiator to dry. You're welcome.
We've had amazing artists performing in WOW. Angelique Kidjo, Annie Lennox, Sinead O'Connor. We've also had amazing world speakers, Malala, Christine Lagarde. That idea of a festival allows all ages, all backgrounds, all experiences to be reflected there.
Being able to come into a room and see all the different views that women have.
WOW festivals have a pattern in them, and that's why they're scalable and transferable, and that's why they're happening all over the world. Okay. Oh. Right. So, the final thing I would say is that I referred there to think-ins. Sometimes I call them gatherings. I would say that a kind of key part of what I do now as my practice is before I decide anything other than my own commitment to the idea of a festival and test out my fear of doing it. I then gather many, many people together of all different backgrounds, people I don't know, people who don't know each other, and I say, if you were doing this festival, what would you do? And I now know that that doesn't make people then take over, which is often one's fear. it actually makes people go, that's an interesting question. And I can honestly say that I've had thoughts and ideas and heard voices that I would never have heard if I just basically got together a group of arts practitioners around me and went, okay, let's decide to do this, this, and this. Even with art forms that you think nobody cares about and doesn't know much about, it's this idea of accepting the fact that festivals are all of us, and us is audience, and us is performer, and us is curator, all of us. Being able to gather us, whatever that looks like symbolically, together, and then speaking about what could it be like, what could we dream it could be like. You will have so many exciting ideas as a result. You don't have to use any of them. Nobody ever comes back to me and goes, I told you it had to contain a washing machine and a mouse. Nobody ever has said that to me. What they have gone is, I've never been asked before, but I'll be there. And so I think, just to finish on this idea that when you think of festival, in your mind, you will be thinking of people arriving and enjoying themselves and coming. Think about, if you're not already doing it, how could those people be part of the co-creation? Because that has been one of my great joys and great discoveries, and has made me very happy, because I've also had to have conversations with people who I would have been scared to talk to because I didn't know them. Don't ask audiences to take risks that you're not prepared to take yourself. Thank you.
Jude, thank you very much on behalf of the Arts Council. Thank you so much for a very considered and inspiring speech. And I think everyone here, I'm sure, will agree that we will leave the room identifying as festival makers and as artists. And it's something that we're just beginning the conversation on in terms of festivals. We're going to have about 15 minutes for a question and answer session with Jude. So if anyone doesn't have a seat, you can slip into an empty seat now. That might be quite good. And we've turned the heat off, just so you know. Would anyone like to start the ball rolling? We've got a mic to you. Yeah, just no, we just need to mic you. Yeah, because we're live streaming.
Just to kick it off, I just want to say that you articulated something that I have felt in my bones but never heard anyone articulate or had the understanding myself to articulate. So I just want to say thank you so much for taking the time to share your knowledge and wisdom with us all.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Sinead Connolly from Dublin City Council Arts Office, and also a number of festivals in the city. I was just wondering, on your very last point about bringing people together and to discuss, you know, how would you approach this? What have you found are the useful ways of doing that? Or, you know, is it in large conversational groups, or is it small pockets of interest? Or I'm sure it's many of those things, but I'd love to hear a little bit more about it.
Well, I've found that the least interesting group are same genre arts practitioners, bringing together a group of people who are theoretically like-minded, but actually groomed to be competitive. Isn't very fertile. Unless you can get beyond that thing that we all share, you know, that brittle anxiety about, are they better than me? Are they doing better than me? Do they even know what I did? And, you know, all that. Unless you can get beyond that, actually, I find those, they're very protected spaces in some way. And often it brings out the worst in me. just say that because you can't sort of get this sort of idea of like the reality that, the fact that this work is personal. So when people come in with their sort of professional starting point as a group, it's very hard to get them to look like us. It's very hard to get us to shove that off. So I try to gather people together, including those people of, you know, young people. I mean, I say young, like 11, 12-year-olds, people who aren't in the arts at all, people who are lawyers. I mean, just a variety of people who I imagine I'd like to come to the festival. So if I have in my mind, like, who would I like to be here? And you go, well, I'd love them, but they never come. That's where you begin. You begin with the people who you can't imagine being there, but you really want them. And you have to find a way of extending an invitation that isn't just an email via a community group. So it's actually a kind of a research practice that makes you go and meet people. And then, of course, the responsibility, which is what becomes quite real, is that they then do invest in you personally. They come to the thinking, because you, Jude Kelly, have asked them, and they think that you know. It's not kind of crazy or anything, but they invest in you trying to make this festival happen. And they believe that, that they're being asked because you want them there, which is true. So I would say that the gatherings are best when they're between 15 to 40 people. You have to facilitate it and explain why you need them. And it is about needing them. It's not about sort of focus groups or, whatever. You've got to do it as artistic practice. But I think starting with who do you imagine would be there? Who would make you feel happy? One of the great feelings I think you probably all experience, sometimes you look out at a festival that you've helped make or made, and you feel such happiness, because you can see all these people having joy. And, we want to create love. And so I think that, like, putting together groups of strangers, they walk in the room and think, oh, I don't really know any of these people. Arts practitioners walk into a room and they go, God, I know everybody, God. And so, I'm not excluding this, of course. Today is going to be amazing. I mean, amazing. I'm not saying there's no purpose in that. But anyway, that's a long answer. But I think, again, I keep starting from the idea of what do you fear doing, but you wish you could? Is that one there first? Yeah.
There we go. Dermot McIntyre with the Hearsay Audio Arts Festival. Again, thank you so much. It actually also felt like a validation for sort of like the sacrifices I think that as festival makers we make when you're saying that. So, and thanks to the organisers. I'm intrigued. There seems to ask, when you talk about that generation of ideas, you use that phrase, they're coming because Jude Kelly asked them to come. And you're distilling a set of ideas and then you're transforming that into your curatorial practice. But you also use the phrase about the women of the world, about how there was a pattern and then that was scalable. So I'm interested to understand, how do you scale beyond Jude Kelly?
Yes, absolutely, and it's a really important and quite difficult question. By the way, I'm not sort of a megalomaniac in the sense of like they've all got to come to it for me. What I mean is that if you extend a personal invitation, you have to follow that up. It can't be just like it wasn't really me. I just used my signature. It's to do with a kind of personal commitment to the honesty of that relationship. But of course, it quickly then turns into them loving WOW, believing in WOW, meeting other women who do WOW. So it builds and builds and builds way beyond the personal into, though, a carrying forward of the values that you hoped you would engender between you all. So it has to carry on being value-led in all the different encounters. But talking about a pattern, yes, I made WOW as an architectural framework with a series of places in which you could put content. It's got an architecture to it. It's got Wow Bites, it's got Keynote, it's got the marketplace. It's actually designed as an actual festival. And so when I gather people together, I say, here are the places that content can go into. What kind of content do you want? So, of course, you know, if you're going to have sort of pop-ups as part of your festival, pop-up visual, pop-up dance, pop-up music, then, you know, what are all the thousands of ideas you could have? If you're definitely going to have safe spaces to talk about things that are theoretically transgressive, you know, what are those things that we can't talk about? So I have, in my practice, made frameworks and shapes. So the one that I'm doing at the moment in Manchester for human rights will entirely be built around poetry and feasting. And I've designed a festival frame. That is my practice. So I'm not going to people and saying, how do we do this festival? I'm not doing that. I'm saying here is a kind of a shape that I imagine it to be. They might then say, well, where's the space in that for social dancing? And I might go, actually, my festival hasn't thought that through properly. So it is also a testing space, but you're not throwing away a curatorial practice.
And in which way are you communicating that? Is that sort of through a set of documentation, or is it still you acting as an evangelical communicator of the ethos and the principles, and people coming to one festival before they go to replicate?
With the number of WOW festivals that there are now around the world, it doesn't all rest on me. No, it is through documentation, but it's actually through phone calls, Skype calls. It's still very, very handmade. So the people who work on WOW, and it's a very small team, work with other women around the world and actually get to know them and say, well, this is what we do. The key thing is we're saying, this is the frame. If you want to create your own festival, blessings on you, but this is what the WOW Festival is like, and this is what it believes in. So as an example, you know, when we went to Baltimore to do WOW, and they've been doing it now for 6 years, such a racially divided space. And the women who initially wanted to do it were actually nervous of how they used WOW to make interracial conversations. We just said, well, you can't do it unless you do. So you can't have the ability to do it. So we're also kind of working on what does intersectional practice look like? What does it really, really look like? And how do we teach each other to be better at it? Is that enough of an answer? Yeah.
Hi, Jude. My name is Eddie McGuinness. I am the Festival Director of Dublin LGBTQ Pride. And one thing about Pride is diversity in itself. But within your festival itself of WOW is we have a calling within our trans community to have even a bigger and louder voice, and even trans and intersex elements of that. In a way, festivals are still afraid of integrating both with the LGBT community, but also within our trans community. But how have you done that as well? Because you've given some platforms through your festival itself.
Well, the WOW Festival's mantra is, if you identify as a woman or you know a woman, it's for you. That's it. And I wouldn't expect people to go onto panels or perform or do anything only to represent the one identity that might have been put onto them or that they might want to claim. It won't be their only identity. So the first thing is to say that anybody who takes part will not only be taking part because they are this, but because they're a human who wants to talk about, they might want to talk about, you know, being a trans grandmother, or they might want to talk about being a vegetarian, regardless, you know. So we accommodate it by just starting with a position that we're all humans in the same space. And it seems to work because if other people want to create other kinds of spaces that are more specific than that, then they can go and do it.
Hi there. Tom Creed. I'm a theatre and opera director and sometime festival maker. And as we sit here in the sweltering heat, I find myself thinking about the climate emergency and about all of the travel that we do, the artists that we do, all of the materials that we produce. And I'm interested just to hear about anything you've done or anything that you've been thinking about in relation to festivals and how we deal with the encroaching emergency.
Well, funny enough, we just at the WOW Festival signed off an environmental policy yesterday, but that's not going to change much. I'll answer that in a couple of ways. We haven't, as humans, I don't think, bettered the experience of meeting each other. You know, we all know that. So meeting each other changes the bond. And the idea that you all then say, well, you know, we will go back to our worlds not really ever connecting in flesh terms because we can't fly, or we'll have to get boats. I just can't see that exchange of one thing for another can quite work. And I also can imagine very quickly where all artists decide to not fly, but it won't make any difference to corporates because they'll all be getting on organising their Davoses and whatever. So I haven't got an answer. I'm as perplexed as maybe you are. What I do think is that I'm much more interested than I used to be at a real level in hearing the conversations with Indigenous people who, in a long arc, probably have a huge amount that needs to be understood again. And I think that it's a very important and not just tokenistic thing that we could do, which is hear from Indigenous peoples about land preservation and land rights and so on and so on. And then I'm also waiting for technology to sort a lot of stuff out. I just think that I can't imagine anything, you'll think I'm a bit crazy here, but I can't imagine the human imagination creating anything in literature or art form that couldn't actually really happen. So I am waiting for sort of what Star Trek, you know, beaming people up and back and everything. I am definitely waiting for technology to solve some of that problem. That's not going to happen immediately, I realise, but I do think that we'll be able to do a lot more virtually than we used to through AI. And in the meantime, I don't know, I'm just muddling on.
Thanks.
Jude, thank you very much once again for your time, and we really appreciate you coming over and coming back to see us, so thank you very much.
Great. Thank you. Won't you? It's 6th, 7th and 8th of March. If you identify as a woman or you know one. Okay?
Thank you.